Our illegal deportation, in actual fact, the fact that we were kicked out of Zimbabwe, demonstrates to you that the ZANU-PF regime in that country is afraid of exposing themselves by allowing observers, researchers like ourselves into that country, because they're afraid of what we will see. And what we experienced during the short period of time that we were in that country is the fact that this autocracy is presiding over what effectively is a failed state in Zimbabwe, an undemocratic state that ultimately preys on its citizens and does not want the rest of the world to see this. We had gone to Zimbabwe to undertake research around the elections. We basically wanted to find out what the electoral conditions were, whether there was good and effective governance that would allow for the execution of a free and fair election, an election that would ultimately represent the will of the people. Interestingly enough, when we arrived on that Tuesday, we were questioned by an official who claimed also to be part of immigration services, or at least a government official, who asked us a couple of questions. What was our mission? How long we intended to be in that country? And then after we had answered these questions, we were basically permitted to enter into Bulawayo, into Zimbabwe. Walking down the streets of Bulawayo, my old neighborhood where I grew up, it represented so much in terms of potential. It was a vibrant economy. It was a society that was very much emblematic of the reconciliation that was sort of promised by President Robert Mugabe in the 1980s. So both blacks and whites living in this area, living side by side together and enjoying a relatively high standard of living. But what was sad about it also was realizing that the impact of the economic decline, the political decline in Zimbabwe, had basically meant that many of the families who had lived in this neighborhood had opted to vote with their feet. They had decided in many ways to live outside of the country. So it was walking through a very familiar place with very many people who I had experienced having had left the country and finding themselves on foreign shores, because Zimbabwe was certainly not the boom potential country of the 1980s. In stark contrast was going to the National University of Science and Technology and seeing the fantastic development that was there and the innovation that was provided to students, even though it was somewhat superficial in the sense that we saw the buildings from the outside, the development and the infrastructure that was being built as part of the National University of Science and Technology. It did indicate to us that there was potential for growth, for development in Zimbabwe that had nothing to do with the politics. It's calculated that upwards of 67% of that country's population are the youth. The sad thing about it is that many of them find themselves with limited opportunities to access jobs in the formal economy. Many of them have to become vendors selling wares on the streets in order to simply survive. Now, those who can find employment, menial jobs in the formal sector, for example, as waiters, are highly educated, very ambitious, but also at the same time very conscious of the fact that the economy is in decline, that the situation and the conditions in Zimbabwe have increasingly seen them having to live in a country that experiences triple-digit inflation and limited opportunities in the formal sector. One of the interesting interactions with many of the youthful people is you got a sense that this was a country that experienced deep levels of repression. In actual fact, the limiting or narrowing of democratic space meant that even many of the youth that you interact with are very skeptical of expressing themselves. truly and genuinely, because they're not quite sure what the intentions are in a society that has increasingly become securitized, where state security agents spend their time listening to people, spying on their own citizens. So the youth themselves don't experience the freedoms that many youth across the world do. And this results in them becoming hesitant and very cautious in their interactions with anyone. We are seeing a situation in Zimbabwe that is emblematic of what happens in the worst types of dictatorships. In the worst types of dictatorships, rights of the people are not respected, basic freedoms are not respected, and ultimately what happens is we've seen the securitization of the state, where civilian authorities have, for all intents and purposes, been replaced by these repressive, military-led securocrats. So our ejection from Zimbabwe in this process that leads to what ultimately is an illegal deportation from Zimbabwe starts off with our GGA team in a team meeting downstairs in the lobby. We're suddenly encountered by individuals who claimed to be from Zimbabwe's Department of Immigration. And they wanted us to present ourselves to their offices downtown in Bulawayo. They sat us down and took us through an extensive interrogation where they were asking us what our mission was there, who we intended to engage with. I asked them directly, have we done anything wrong? And their response was that, according to them, they could find nothing that we had contravened in terms of the law, in terms of our entry into Zimbabwe. They got up and indicated to us that they needed now to confer with their seniors. And then a very somber looking group of officials came into the room and very apologetically indicated to us that they had been instructed to eject us from Zimbabwe.
Can you proceed for departure, please?
We were ordered abruptly to pack our bags immediately and ultimately find ourselves on the next available flight out of that country.